So let's take a look at the four senses of Scripture, which are defined by the Catechism of the Catholic Church, numbers 115 to 119. This is an important perspective in context with which we read the Scriptures, read the Gospels, the New Testament, the Old Testament. There are four senses that are described. Actually, two groups that were described and introduced by St. Thomas Aquinas. The first is the literal, and second, the spiritual. And the spiritual actually has three senses: the allegorical, the moral, and the anagogical. So the four then are literal, allegorical, moral, and anagogical. And the literal sense is essentially what the author is intending, or this is where we do exegesis, biblical exegesis. We look at what the book is actually saying, what the stories are actually saying. This is the foundation by which we can actually make spiritual conclusions about the texts. And there's three types of spiritual signs or perspectives which we can read the Scriptures. One would be allegorical, and this was very popular among the early church fathers, was to look at the Scriptures and see symbols. So the Red Sea, the parting of the Red Sea in the Old Testament, or Noah's Ark in the Old Testament, actually are symbols for the Christ's baptism, or the sacrament of baptism. So we can look at the Scripture stories and make a connection to the Old Testament. And this is actually called typology, and this is also described in the Catechism. The second way of looking at Scripture was to look at the moral, or tropological is the technical way of describing this, the sense of Scripture that tells us how we should act. We read a Scripture and it turns us back towards ourselves. And so, for example, we could read the prodigal son, and the prodigal son parable is telling us to be in a number. We can put ourselves in the places of the many different people in the stories, and find out ways in which we should be acting, being forgiving ourselves, looking for reconciliation or penance, and that sort of thing. And finally, anagogical, which is a little tough word to remember, but essentially it means the future sense of Scripture, or the sense of Scripture that points us towards heaven, points us towards the goal which we have to be in communion with God. And there's a number of parables that do this, the wedding feast parables. You can look at the book of Revelation. That's often used as the primary example of anagogical senses of Scripture. But we need to look at all of these senses of Scripture together, that they all make up an important part of the way we read Scripture. And the Vatican II was very good at describing this, and even in Pope Benedict XVI's recent book, Jesus of Nazareth, he pointed out the significance of looking at this sense of the Scriptures as a whole.